Kofi was a boy of 12 years, always curious about the world around him. He lived with his mother, Oma, who was known for making the best yam porridge in the village. Kofi's father had passed away when he was very young, so it was just the two of them. They were happy, but they didn't have much. Kofi always wished for more, especially when he saw other children with toys and nice clothes. One day, while playing near the edge of the forest, Kofi saw something strange. It was an old calabash, half buried in the dirt. Kofi brought the calabash home to show his mother. Oma looked at it with wide eyes. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kofi told her about the forest. Oma frowned and said, "This is not an ordinary calabash, Kofi. It looks like something from the old stories. You should take it back." "Please, Mama," Kofi begged, "let me keep it. It's just a calabash." That night, Kofi placed the calabash next to his bed. He dreamed of having a new pair of shoes, just like the ones his friend Yo had. When Kofi woke up, he felt something under his blanket. Kofi's eyes widened in shock. "How did this get here?" he whispered to himself. He didn't tell his mother about the shoes. Instead, he wore them the next day, feeling proud as he walked through the village. Everyone noticed the shoes, and Kofi smiled to himself, thinking about how lucky he was. Over the next few days, Kofi began to wish for more things. He wished for a new shirt, a basket of mangoes, and even a shiny new knife for his mother. Each time he wished, the calabash seemed to hum softly, and the next morning, his wish would come true. But with each wish, the calabash grew warmer and warmer, almost too hot to touch. One night, as Kofi was about to fall asleep, he heard a voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, and it seemed to be coming from the calabash. "What do you wish for next, Kofi?" the voice asked. Kofi jumped up, startled. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no answer. Only the soft hum of the calabash. Kofi shook his head, thinking he must be hearing things. But the voice didn't go away. Every night, it whispered to him, asking him what he wanted, tempting him with promises of more. Kofi began to feel uneasy. He remembered his mother's warning about the calabash. But he also liked getting everything he wished for. It was so easy, and it made him happy. So, he kept making wishes, each one bigger than the last. Then, one day, something strange happened. Kofi wished for a big feast for the entire village. He wanted everyone to have the best food and drink. The next morning, when he went outside, the village square was filled with tables covered in food. The villagers were amazed and happy, thanking Kofi for his generosity, but as the feast went on, something went wrong. The food began to spoil quickly, turning bad before anyone could finish eating. The drinks turned bitter, and the villagers started to feel sick. Kofi watched in horror as his friends and neighbors became ill, realizing that his wish had caused this. That night, the voice from the calabash was louder. "You have made your wishes, Kofi. Now it is time to pay the price." Kofi lived in a small village called Iba. The people in Iba were simple, and they loved their peaceful life. Kofi was a boy of 12 years, always curious about the world around him. He lived with his mother, Oma, who was known for making the best yam porridge in the village. Kofi's father had passed away when he was very young, so it was just the two of them. They were happy, but they didn't have much. Kofi always wished for more, especially when he saw other children with toys and nice clothes. One day, while playing near the edge of the forest, Kofi saw something strange. It was an old calabash, half buried in the dirt. It was unlike any calabash he had ever seen. The outside was covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow in the sunlight. Curious, Kofi picked it up and wiped off the dirt. The calabash felt warm in his hands, and when he held it up to the light, it shone brightly. Kofi brought the calabash home to show his mother. Oma looked at it with wide eyes. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kofi told her about the forest. Oma frowned and said, "This is not an ordinary calabash, Kofi. It looks like something from the old stories. You should take it back." But Kofi didn't want to. The calabash was the most interesting thing he had ever found. "Please, Mama," Kofi begged, "let me keep it. It's just a calabash." Oma sighed and shook her head. "Be careful, Kofi," she warned. "Sometimes, things are not what they seem." That night, Kofi placed the calabash next to his bed. He dreamed of having a new pair of shoes, just like the ones his friend Yo had. They were bright red and shiny. In his dream, he saw himself wearing those shoes, running faster than anyone else in the village. When Kofi woke up, he felt something under his blanket. He pulled it back, and there, on the floor, were the exact shoes he had dreamed of. Kofi's eyes widened in shock. How did this get here? He whispered to himself. He didn't tell his mother about the shoes. Instead, he wore them the next day, feeling proud as he walked through the village. Everyone noticed the shoes, and Kofi smiled to himself, thinking about how lucky he was. Over the next few days, Kofi began to wish for more things. He wished for a new shirt, a basket of mangoes, and even a shiny new knife for his mother. Each time he wished, the calabash seemed to hum softly, and the next morning, his wish would come true. But with each wish, the calabash grew warmer and warmer, almost too hot to touch. One night, as Kofi was about to fall asleep, he heard a voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, and it seemed to be coming from the calabash. "What do you wish for next, Kofi?" the voice asked. Kofi jumped up, startled. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no answer. Only the soft hum of the calabash. Kofi shook his head, thinking he must be hearing things. But the voice didn't go away. Every night, it whispered to him, asking him what he wanted, tempting him with promises of more. Kofi began to feel uneasy. He remembered his mother's warning about the calabash. But he also liked getting everything he wished for. It was so easy, and it made him happy. So, he kept making wishes, each one bigger than the last. Then, one day, something strange happened. Kofi wished for a big feast for the entire village. He wanted everyone to have the best food and drink. The next morning, when he went outside, the village square was filled with tables covered in food. The villagers were amazed and happy, thanking Kofi for his generosity, but as the feast went on, something went wrong. The food began to spoil quickly, turning bad before anyone could finish eating. The drinks turned bitter, and the villagers started to feel sick. Kofi watched in horror as his friends and neighbors became ill, realizing that his wish had caused this. That night, the voice from the calabash was louder. "You have made your wishes, Kofi. Now it is time to pay the price." Kofi's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what the calabash meant by price, but he knew it wasn't good. The next morning, he decided to take the calabash back to the forest. He couldn't keep it anymore. But when he tried to leave his house, the door wouldn't open. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Kofi was trapped. The calabash hummed louder and louder, filling the room with its eerie sound. The voice returned, now angry. You cannot escape, Kofi. You wanted more, and now you must give more. Kofi was terrified. He didn't know what to do. He ran to his mother's room, but she wasn't there. The house was empty, and the air was thick with the calabash's power. Kofi knew he had to do something, but what? How could he make things right? He had to find a way, before it was too late. Kofi sat on the floor, his mind racing. The calabash glowed with a strange, red light, and the voice echoed in his ears. Give more, Kofi. Give me what you love most. Kofi thought about his mother, his friends, his village. He didn't want to lose any of them. He realized that all the things he had wished for didn't really make him happy. What made him happy was his life before the calabash, simple, but filled with love and peace, with a burdened heart. Kofi knew what he had to do. He picked up the calabash, now burning hot, and whispered, I wish to undo everything. I wish to go back to the way things were before. The calabash hummed one last time, and then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went dark. Kofi felt a strange sensation, as if he were floating. The voice was gone, the humming had stopped, and the air was still. When Kofi opened his eyes, he was back in his room. The calabash was gone, and the morning light was streaming through the window. Everything seemed normal again. Kofi quickly ran outside. The village was as it had always been. People were walking around, talking and laughing. There was no sign of the feast or the sickness. Kofi's heart soared with relief. He ran to his mother, who was in the kitchen making breakfast. She smiled when she saw him. Good morning, Kofi, she said, as if nothing had happened. Kofi hugged his mother tightly. I'm sorry, Mama, he whispered, though he knew she wouldn't understand. But he did. He had learned a powerful lesson. Some things were more valuable than riches. And sometimes, it was best to be happy with what you already had. But as Kofi turned to leave the kitchen, he noticed something on the floor. It was a small, round object, half buried in the dirt. His heart skipped a beat. It was another calabash, just like the one he had thrown away. The symbols on it glowed faintly in the morning light. Kofi took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't just leave it there. But what would he do with it? The last time, it had brought nothing but trouble. This time, he had to be smarter, more careful. The village was safe now, but for how long? And what would happen if someone else found the calabash? Kofi picked it up, feeling its warmth, and wondered what to do next. Kofi held the new calabash in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his skin. His heart pounded as he remembered the nightmares the last one had brought. He knew he couldn't keep it, but he couldn't just leave it in the village for someone else to find. He needed to get rid of it somewhere far, far away. Kofi quickly grabbed a small bag and slipped the calabash inside, careful not to let anyone see. He didn't even tell his mother. He couldn't risk her worrying or, worse, trying to stop him. As soon as he could, Kofi snuck out of the house and headed toward the forest. The trees in the forest stood tall and silent, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. Kofi shivered as he walked deeper into the woods, the path growing narrower and the air cooler. The forest was known to be a place of mystery, where strange things happened and spirits were said to dwell. But Kofi was determined. He had to find a way to get rid of the calabash for good. As he walked, the calabash seemed to grow warmer, almost as if it knew what he was planning. The warmth turned into a heat that burned through the bag, making Kofi wince. He knew he couldn't turn back, but fear gnawed at his insides. What if the calabash had a mind of its own? What if it refused to let him go? Kofi pushed forward, deeper into the forest. The path twisted and turned, and soon he realized he had lost his way. The trees looked the same, and the thick underbrush made it hard to see the ground. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. Kofi felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He knew he wasn't alone. Suddenly, the calabash began to hum softly, just like the last one. Kofi froze in place, his breath catching in his throat. The humming grew louder, echoing through the trees. He felt a presence behind him, and slowly, he turned around. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed red, and its shape shifted like smoke in the wind. Kofi's heart raced. He had never seen anything like this before. The figure stepped closer, and the calabash hummed even louder, almost as if it were calling out to the creature, Kofi. The figure's voice was a whisper, yet it filled the air around him. You cannot escape your fate. The calabash has chosen you. Kofi's hands trembled as he clutched the bag tightly. What do you want? He stammered, trying to sound brave but failing. Leave me alone. The figure tilted its head, and Kofi felt a cold breeze brush past him. The calabash is a gift, but also a curse. You have tasted its power. Now, it demands more. You cannot simply walk away. Kofi shook his head, backing away slowly. I don't want it. I never wanted any of this. But you wished, the figure hissed, its voice sharp like a blade. And now, the calabash is part of you. Wherever you go, it will follow. Kofi felt a surge of panic. He had to get rid of the calabash, no matter what. He turned and ran as fast as he could, the trees blurring past him. The forest seemed to close in around him, the path twisting in impossible ways. He could hear the figure's laughter behind him. Cold and cruel, he didn't know how long he ran, but eventually, he burst out of the thick trees and into a clearing. Panting heavily, Kofi looked around. The clearing was small, surrounded by ancient trees that towered above him. In the center was a large, flat stone, smooth and shining in the dim light. It looked like a place of power, a place where something could be hidden, or perhaps destroyed. Kofi hurried to the stone, found the calabash on the floor and placed the calabash on top of it. The humming grew louder, and the heat from the calabash intensified, but Kofi didn't back away. He had to finish this. He picked up a large rock from the ground and raised it above his head, ready to smash the calabash to pieces, but before he could bring the rock down, the ground beneath him began to shake. The stone split open, and from the crack, a blinding light shot up into the sky. Kofi stumbled back, dropping the rock in shock. The calabash floated above the stone, spinning slowly as the light grew brighter. The figure from the forest appeared again, standing on the edge of the clearing. You think you can destroy it so easily? It mocked. The calabash is not just an object, Kofi. It is a gateway, a key to a power that is beyond your understanding. Kofi covered his eyes from the intense light, but he refused to give up. I don't want the power. I just want my life back. The figure laughed, a sound that made Kofi's skin crawl. It's too late for that. The calabash has already claimed you. The only way to free yourself is to give it what it desires. Kofi's mind raced. He had no idea what the calabash wanted, and he didn't want to find out. But he knew he couldn't leave it here, not when it was this powerful, this dangerous. He had to do something, anything to stop it. Desperate, Kofi ran toward the calabash, ignoring the figure's warnings. He reached out, grabbing it with both hands, even though it burned his skin. The light flared, and Kofi felt a surge of energy shoot through him. It was overwhelming, a force that threatened to tear him apart. But Kofi held on, refusing to let go. In that moment, he realized what he had to do. The calabash had to be contained, sealed away where it could never harm anyone again. But to do that, he needed to use its power, to control it instead of letting it control him. Kofi closed his eyes and focused, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He pictured the calabash's energy, swirling inside it like a storm. Slowly, he imagined that storm shrinking, growing smaller and smaller, until it was just a tiny spark in the center of the calabash. He imagined that spark being locked away. Hidden deep within the stone, the light began to fade, and the calabash cooled in his hands. Kofi opened his eyes, and to his relief, the calabash was no longer glowing. The figure in the shadows let out a furious roar, but it began to fade as well, dissolving into the air like smoke. Kofi placed the calabash back on the stone, and the crack in the ground closed up, sealing it inside. The forest was silent once more, the danger seemingly past, but as Kofi stood there, catching his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The calabash might be sealed, but its power wasn't gone. It was only sleeping, waiting for the day it would be found again. Kofi knew he had to warn the village, to tell them what had happened. But even as he thought this, he realized something chilling. He had used the calabash's power, even if it was to stop it. What if that power had left its mark on him? What if he had only delayed the inevitable? With a heavy heart, Kofi turned and walked back toward the village, knowing that his life would never be the same. The calabash was hidden, but its shadow still loomed over him, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface. And deep in the forest, the stone that held the calabash began to glow faintly, as if it was waiting, watching, and biding its time. Kofi returned to the village, but the weight of the calabash's power still pressed down on him. He had hidden it away, but its presence lingered in his thoughts, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He knew he had to tell someone about what had happened, but who would believe him? And even if they did, what could they do about it? The calabash had already shown its power. And Kofi feared it might return when they least expected it. Kofi decided to confide in the village elder, Nanaya, a wise and kind woman who had seen many things in her long life. She lived in a small hut at the edge of the village, surrounded by herbs and plants she used to heal the sick. Kofi approached her cautiously, unsure of how to begin. Nanaya welcomed him with a warm smile, but as Kofi explained what had happened, her expression grew serious. She listened carefully, her eyes narrowing as he described the calabash and the strange figure in the forest. When Kofi finished, Nanaya was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Kofi, you have been through a great trial. The calabash is indeed a powerful object, one that was never meant to be found. But you must understand, it is not just the calabash that holds power. You do too." Kofi frowned, confused. "Me? But I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to get rid of it." "True," Nanaya agreed, but the fact that you resisted the Calabash's temptations and chose to use its power to protect others shows great strength. You may not see it now, but you have learned two important lessons. Kofi leaned in, eager to hear what Nanaya had to say. The first lesson, she began, is that greed leads to destruction. You wished for many things, thinking they would make you happy. But in the end, they only brought pain and danger to you and the village. The calabash fed on your desires, growing stronger with each wish. But when you stopped wishing and chose to undo the harm you had caused, you took the first step in breaking its hold over you. Kofi nodded slowly, understanding now. He had been so focused on what he didn't have that he forgot to appreciate what he did have. His greed had blinded him to the real treasures in his life, his mother, his friends, and the simple joys of living in the village. The second lesson, Nanaya continued, is that true strength comes from within. The calabash may have had great power, but it was your courage and determination that saved the village. You faced your fears and took control of a situation that seemed hopeless. Remember, Kofi, power doesn't just come from objects or magic. It comes from your heart and your choices. Kofi felt a warmth spread through him as Nanaya spoke. He realized that he had been stronger than he thought. He had faced the calabash's dark power and had not been consumed by it. Instead, he had used his own strength to protect those he loved, but even with these lessons learned, Kofi knew that the danger wasn't completely gone. Nanaya, he said hesitantly, what if the calabash comes back? What if someone else finds it? Nanaya looked at him thoughtfully. The calabash is a part of our world's mysteries, Kofi. It may one day return, but it can only affect those who let their desires control them. As long as you and the village remember the lessons you've learned, the calabash's power will remain dormant. And if it does return, you now know how to face it. Kofi felt a sense of peace settle over him. He still felt the weight of the responsibility, but he no longer felt alone. Nanaya's words gave him hope that, whatever came next, he would be ready. The days turned into weeks, and life in the village of Iba returned to normal. The villagers, unaware of the calabash's power, went about their daily lives, but Kofi remained vigilant. He kept Nanaya's words close to his heart, knowing that the lessons he had learned would guide him in the future. As time passed, Kofi found himself growing wiser and more thoughtful. He no longer wished for things he didn't need, and he took joy in the simple pleasures of life. He knew that true happiness came from within, and that strength wasn't about having power, but about using it wisely. And deep in the forest, beneath the ancient stone, the calabash remained hidden, its power contained. But it was not forgotten. Kofi knew that one day, its dark whispers might be heard again. But he was ready. He had faced the calabash once before, and he had emerged stronger. And if the time ever came to face it again, he would do so with courage, knowing that true power lies not in the calabash, but in the heart.